Okay guys, in this particular lesson we are going to focus on some key parts and information about ecosystems. So the first thing that we want to point out is how everything in nature is connected, that nothing exists independent of its surroundings. So we focus on the idea of what exactly an ecosystem is, focusing on the fact that an ecosystem is really talking about all of the organisms and their environment. So we're really focusing on talking about those biotic and abiotic factors and how all of those different factors kind of interact with one another in order for the ecosystem to sustain itself. So some examples that we have is the idea of an oak forest being the trees and the animals that live in that forest, along with the rocks, the soil, perhaps if there's a small pond, any of the bacteria in the soil, and so on. Coral reef, the coral itself being living, the water surrounding it not being living though, perhaps plankton in the area, the fish in the area. Even a vacant lot can be considered an ecosystem. We typically look at a vacant lot and think that it's dead, but a vacant lot, if there's grass growing up between the concrete, perhaps there are small insects living in that grass. Oftentimes there's bacteria actually in the asphalt itself. If there's asphalt there, the bacteria is breaking down the asphalt. Perhaps in the vacant lot there may be an abandoned building. If that abandoned building is there may be animals living in the abandoned building. So an ecosystem can take a lot of different shapes. We also want to point out exactly what an organism is. Organism, we're specifically talking about saying a living thing, right? So this is our biology word for anything that's alive is an organism. Then we talk about a species. The species are all similar organisms, and they can mate and make fertile offspring, right? So the crucial thing here is for us to talk about that a species can, we say, successfully reproduce. And what we mean by successfully reproducing is the idea that they can reproduce, and what they create are fertile offspring, and those offspring can recreate and reproduce. So when we talk about a species, we're really focusing on organisms that have very similar genetic makeup to make that possible. So every organism is a member of a particular species. So we have here a meerkat and one individual organism versus the whole entire group of the species. But there are a few loopholes, right? There are some organisms that exist right now, for example, the liger, that are hybrids. They're a cross between different species. Some of them cannot reproduce. We have ligers, we have tigons. So the idea is that there are some differences or some loopholes that exist in science where that's not actually possible. So these different loopholes exist in science, and these different loopholes perhaps create some sort of question as to maybe the definition of species needs to be investigated and maybe modified a little based on these new hybrids that exist in captivity. So liger versus tigon. In addition, we also have populations. Populations are same species, right? Same species, same place, same time. So we're really specific when we talk about a population. So we're talking about all the kangaroos in Sydney, Australia right now, 2010. We do a census for the human population, right? That gives us the ability to measure or count the human population every 10 years. We just finished the 2010 census. We also have communities. Communities are groups of populations, so groups of species, different species in the same area, and they kind of interact with one another. So we have here the idea of this is our forest, right? We have bears in our forest, we have deer in our forest, right? We have squirrels in our forest, skunks in our forest, and porcupine. We also have the trees, owls, we've got the plants, right? We have a woodpecker, etc. All these different species that are in that environment, and they're kind of interacting with one another and depending on one another in order for it to succeed. A habitat is also part of an ecosystem, right? Where that particular organism lives, right? Really, that ecosystem, that particular place, right? You can look at the habitat of all of the members of the ecosystem. All right, so a nice way to kind of break it down and look at it is that A population is the smaller part of a community. A community is the smaller part of an ecosystem, right? When we talk about an ecosystem, we're talking about the community and the habitat, right? We're really focusing on, like I said, those abiotic and biotic factors working together, which is what's going to create our ecosystem. We also have something that's called succession, right? Succession is the idea that, all right, we can think of it to succeed. And by succeed, I don't mean to, be successful and to do well. But what I'm actually talking about is the idea of to follow, right? To succeed someone, right, is to follow in their place. Succession is the idea of how an ecosystem develops over that time and the changes that occur in that particular environment over time. And when we talk about succession, there are reasons for it to happen. There can be sudden, drastic changes in the environment, or it can really just be the gradual environmental change that's prompting this succession. Typically, when we talk about succession, though, it's often referred to in the extremes. So the idea in this drawing, we've got a glacial retreat. The idea that as the glacier is there, there's very little, bare rock left, right? There's nothing living. And as the succession progresses, there becomes more and more life in the environment, right? It starts to build upon itself over time as the organisms can start to succeed, can start to follow simpler organisms. So primary succession, right? When we talk about primary succession, we're talking about that initial, right? That initial establishment of organisms. So we're talking about simple organisms. Oftentimes we're talking about mosses, lichen, right? Lichen is that like bluish green tint, oftentimes grows on rocks and trees. You may mistake it for a fungus or a moss. But it really kind of has a bluish green tint to it, maybe even a little whitish tint to it, maybe looks crusty to you. So those simple organisms are what start the whole process because they require the simplest environment and they can handle some of the more extreme environmental changes. And as the environment becomes more stable, more successful organisms, right, more complex organisms, start to inhabit it. So secondary succession is going to occur as the primary succession is, finishing up. You start to get larger and larger organisms, all right, developing that particular environment.